start with what didn't happen. This is very much a tale that begins actually in mid-May of this year and ends late Saturday night. Though, as many of you know, there are still races to be called and the House is still up for grabs. But winning the Senate for Democrats for us was critical. I should caution that we still need more data. We still need more analytics, especially getting the verified voter files that people will get over the coming weeks. So we should hold off on final conclusions about what drove the election, as there are so many variables, whether it's regional differences in how people register, whether they were able to register on the day of the election, demographic shifts, and also relevant as to when people voted. Some voted on election day, others voted ahead of time. So an interesting front row seat in all of this, as Becky mentioned, largely the democratic ecosystem of higher dollar donors, though with access to progressive WhatsApp groups. And over the course of the last few months, I hosted various candidates in our home, co-hosted candidates at the homes of others. And I had the privilege, among others, of hosting two bellwether candidates who won and two whose races I felt were tough, and they unfortunately did not win. But coming into mid-May, and this is, as I said, critical to understanding what happened, we were confronted with conventional wisdom that you are now somewhat familiar with, and when Martha gets through with her presentation, we'll be fully familiar with. But in short, the party in power does very poorly. There was one exception, which was after 9/11. But other than that, Democrats have been looking at or had a history of losing 54 to 60 some seats, particularly when the president's approval rating was in the mid-40s, as it was this time around. Second, the headwinds around the economy, with gas prices surging over $5, which I know is a bargain relative to central London, and polling that showed that the economy inflation would drive the outcome. Third, the Biden approval rating in the low 40s, not unlike Trump's ratings, though his never got above 50%. Fourth, a Republican Party that was shameless in not only perpetuating the big lie, but fielding candidates up and down the ballot, from Congress to secretaries of state, who would be ideally placed to overturn the 2024 elections were they to have won this time around. It is hard to overemphasize how pernicious this threat to our democracy could have been. There were over 300 candidates on the ballot, including candidates who were present at the Capitol at the Capitol on January 6th, who we generally describe as election deniers, and there are various elements to what constitutes that. But for purposes of this, understand that whether it was the Maryland governor, the Pennsylvania governor, the Arizona Senate candidate, Blake Masters, the candidates running, again, all Republican candidates, the Senate New Hampshire, the Senate from Nevada, the Senate from Pennsylvania. There are two that are still to be called, Carrie Lake at the governor of Arizona race, and finally Herschel Walker. That race is going into runoff. So going into this election, the National Republican Congressional Committee projected winning 30 seats, and the punditry followed, though the polling did not, and I will get into that over the course of the next 10 minutes as well. But this was turbocharged by a sense among Democrats that we didn't have message, that our tent was too big, that we had made mistakes back in 2020 around defunding police, that we were socialists and so on. But nonetheless, the snapshot today, the Democrats will hold the Senate rather than losing 6 to 8 seats, as conventional wisdom would have suggested. Thank you, Alethea. The House, we are within reach of winning. It is not so probable, but it is possible. Worst case, we lose up to 4 seats. And then finally, state legislatures. And it is critically important that people understand the roles of state legislatures. This is not something that Democrats historically had focused on, certainly since Obama, when we tended to go for that bright, shiny thing, the national elections. But this is the first time that the party in power actually picked up seats. Like most US elections, there are countless factors, though, that play into the results. Midterms, though, differ in one significant respect from the presidential, and that is that we had no president at the top of the ticket. But that's not to say that presidents don't matter. And in the background here, we had Trump. Trump, in a phrase, was a gift to Democrats, as he forced many voters tired of the far right to consider a choice among two alternatives, Trump or Biden, rather than making this a referendum on Biden. And Biden, by the way, obliged by calling out the MAGA Republicans. I first heard him do this effectively at a fundraiser in May. Many of his advisors, by the way, were pleading with him not to do this. But back to May. And first we had the leak of the Dobbs decision in May, followed by the actual opinion coming out at the end of June. I should note that when this leaked, pollsters were only seeing a negligible increase in sentiment, maybe perhaps a psychological reaction to dealing with the hypothetical. But by July, the response was full-throated, aided by headlines worthy of The Handmaid's Tale. So Dobbs not only became a rallying force at the grassroots level, but it gave countless House members running for re-election in tough districts, what we called frontliners, and for the first time, the red to blue candidates, messaging that resonated particularly with that critical cohort that propelled us in 2018 to victory, that is independent and moderate suburban Republican women. For the first time, by the way, Democrats were speaking about abortion, just as we were speaking about gun rights. Historically, those were issues that we tended to run away from. So this became the election about reproductive freedom, about getting government out of the waiting room. It was brilliant as it allowed us to recapture one theme from the Republicans who never failed to wrap themselves in the flag. So liberty. Secondly, they had that subliminal messaging to the small government voter. And finally, an economic message, as Governor Whitmer noted, the ability to decide whether and when to have a child is the biggest economic decision a woman will make in her lifetime. So by July, very quickly, the trifecta of potential messaging was around abortion, around gun violence, and the January 6 hearings. And in August, we had the first verdict in conservative Kansas, where voters voted to preserve the right to abortion. Republicans were the majority of the registered electorate. At least 25% of them voted no in our favor. And Dobbs motivated progressives to turn out, as well as motivating conservative voters to vote the right way. We also saw a noticeable gender gap for the first time, largely unmarried young women. So come to the election, and very quickly, I think abortion was key in the states where it mattered. Michigan, example, less so Nevada, New York, or Oregon. Governor Whitmer won her race. Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State, won her race, as did 3 members of the House whose races were considered very much at risk. In addition, Michigan flipped its state legislator Democrat for the first time in 40 years. I should note, by the way, that the abortion initiative in Michigan, all of which, by the way, not only Michigan's went the right way, but that received 53,000 more votes than Governor Whitmer herself. Second, abortion was twinned with democracy. Democracy was on the ballot, but nonetheless, it wasn't a line item. But nonetheless, I think that it drove a significant number of people to vote the way they did, notwithstanding or not putting it in terms of or framing it as a matter of democracy. So ultimately, it appears that swing voters were more concerned about how Republicans handled reproductive rights than how Democrats handled the economy and inflation. And those concerns, by the way, were heightened across voting districts by what I call the Trump effect. By the way, I recall hearing a string of women high up in the Democratic firmament at an event in October here in DC, the closing mantra of which was, the GOP has no idea how angry women are. They're about to find out, and we did. Secondly, candidate quality mattered. Democracy was on the ballot in that respect as well. And as I noted earlier, we didn't really frame it at that. But there are countless examples of election deniers, and I'll just highlight one, given that we have a few minutes left here. A candidate running in Washington as a rural Democrat, a small business owner, ran on abortion and fighting climate change, as well as protecting Second Amendment, so gun rights. Her Trump-endorsed opponent, who is expected to win in this Trump +4 district, won his primary, by the way, against one of the Republican House members who voted to impeach Trump. He denied the legitimacy of the Biden win in 2020 and had supported arrested Jan 6 insurrectionists. 538 had this candidate a 2 in 100 chance of winning, and she won. So again, another driver going down my litany, the fruits of hard work, a sea change, by the way, in the way Democrats ran. Alyssa Slotkin and Abigail Spanberger, both of whom I hosted, in effect ran to lose better. In other words, they went into rural red districts where Democrats don't normally do well in terms of trying to change the outcome by small margins. Third, a great night for those who protect democracy at the coalface, secretaries of state and attorneys general. Going down further on the takeaways, these elections were smooth and largely unmarred by violence. We also benefited from ticket splitting, something we've not seen in our hyper-polarized environment, which I think bodes well going forward for that general sense of democracy.
Sure.
Finally, the pundits also had a bad night. Again, the number of pollsters that got it right, but these are razor thin margins, and yet the mainstream press, as well, I think, as Democrats, had so many people convinced that this was going to go the wrong way. And there's one key element to all of this, which is that these races require money. And as donors were looking at the polls and then the interpretation of the polls, there was a sense of taking the foot off the gas pedal. For example, Mandela Barnes at his race against Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So in any event, that really sets the stage for where we are. And I'll look forward to the discussion as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I remember when I saw you back in June, you at the beginning of June, you predicted that Dobbs was going to be incredibly influential, and so it came to pass. To any of you watching, I really do recommend that you look at Mark's blog. If you look in the chat, you'll see the address, and it's endlessly insightful. Thank you, Mark. I'm now going to ask Martha Elliot to speak. Martha has an amazing track record of being a TV producer, news and current affairs, and more recently writing books. Again, have a look in the chat for links to Martha's book. Her most recent one, which is about the death penalty, is really moving and important. And also she has a very significant book on the Constitution. And Mark actually referred to this, but the last 6 years has been an extraordinary stress test of America's Constitution and its institutions. And as someone who is a part-time resident of California, I am incredibly relieved that those institutions and that Constitution have passed that stress test. I hand over now to Martha Elliot. Thank you, Martha.
Hi, I'm speaking to you from Maine, where I live, and that comes into play a little bit when I talk about Electoral College. I have to admit, I was very worried, not in just the days and the months, but even in the 18 months ahead of the election, because I was afraid the election deniers were going to win. And there were election deniers on all levels. And the most significant being not, I mean, obviously it mattered for the Congress because we wanted to keep control of it. with Democrats, but also with the people who would control the 2024 election, the secretaries of state. And by the way, not one election denier won his race for Secretary of State in any state. And secondly, for governor. And by and large, most of them did not succeed. And we still are waiting on Kerry Lake in Arizona. But election deniers did not do as well as they thought they would do. Now, the reason I was afraid was because Donald Trump had said that if the House was taken back, he would run for office in 2024. I think he picked the House in part because he wanted Nancy Pelosi out of office, but also because that seemed to be the most the House where more liberal legislation was getting passed and where there were more things going on anti-Trump, investigations of him, the impeachments of him, and the January 6th committee hearings, etc. And we saw after the election that he was willing to do anything. He made it clear that the fact that he put his hand on a Bible and swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States meant nothing to him. He was willing to bully election officials. He was willing to put pressure on his own vice president to reject a vote which he had no control over in the House, the ratification of the Electoral College results. He was willing to do just about, he'd go to the courts with phony lawsuits, anything to stay in power. He could not admit that he would lose. And he finally resorted to violence, to igniting what became the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And if any of you have watched the hearings on that, as I have, every second of it, it made me, a very, very, very liberal Democrat, have great respect for a very conservative Republican, Liz Cheney, who cared more about the Constitution of the United States than about keeping her seat in Congress. And she lost in the primary in Wyoming, a very conservative state. And but that didn't matter to her. She's now going to run a PAC that's dedicated to keeping election deniers out of Congress. And as Mark mentioned, historically, the party in power loses seats during the election. And, for just as an example, Obama went into office with a 257 seat majority, and you need 218 seats in the House to keep control, and a 60 seat, which is a super majority, because you need 51 to control in the Senate. And in the midterms, he lost 63 seats in the House and 12 seats in the Senate, which he called a shellacking. The fact that the tide was not turned in that direction of a red wave is extraordinary. As Mark mentioned, only Bush was able to avoid losing seats, but that was right after 9/11. The only other time in recent history is 60 years ago with John F. Kennedy that the Democrats did not lose seats. And so anyway, another reason that we had to fear about Democrats losing seats and Republicans winning was reapportionment. And our Constitution requires that every 10 years, starting in 1790, and so on the first of the decade, there must be a census held, and every person, not citizen, every person living in the United States is counted, which is why the Republicans tried to make it so that you had to say whether or not you were legal or not, and whether or not you were a citizen or not in the census. And it scared some people away from answering the census questions. And so that might have been skewed. There are 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That number was artificially frozen in the turn of the 20th century because they realized that they couldn't keep growing and growing and growing the number of people in the House of Representatives. And so the way it was to be done was to figure out how many people in each state and divide, take a denominator and divide the 435 and then decide who gets how many seats. Now, the thing is that the Constitution guarantees that every state gets one representative, even if they don't meet that threshold number of minimum. So a state like Wyoming, where Liz Cheney was from, which only has 563,000 people in it, might not have gotten a seat in Congress if that weren't the case, that guarantee. Every state is guaranteed 2 senators, and the reason for that is because there was, when the Constitution was created, there were small states and large states, and the small states came in first with the New Jersey plan, which wanted a unicameral house in which each state would get 1 vote. That did not sit very well with states like Virginia and New York, which had and Massachusetts had much larger populations. They came up with a Virginia plan, which would have it done by population and including slaves. And then Connecticut came up with a compromise, which was, okay, we'll have 2 houses. The House of Representatives would be done by population, and the Senate would be done, everybody gets an equal vote. And the Senate is where we now have a very, very, very skewed representation. And why the red states have so much power, especially in the Electoral College. With reapportionment, in most states, what happens is that once they decide how many seats you get, in most states, the legislature decides how the lines are going to be drawn. We have a Supreme Court decision which says 1 man, 1 vote. Well, really 1 person, 1 vote, or anybody over 18 persons and 1 vote. That means that they have to try to get the same number of people in each district in each state. I thought that, well, I'll hold that thought for a minute. I did a rough estimate of whether or not we were keeping to the any kind of equality in that way. And I took all this population of all the states in the last census and the total number of people in the United States. I divided it by 435, and I came up with 762,000 rounded up would be what was be the needed to get one person if you were doing it by population and not giving the smaller states a pass. And there are 5 or 6 states that would not have had a representative if it weren't for that guarantee. I was surprised, however, about how when I used my simple method of dividing that, giving them all their one representative and giving then proportionately rounding up if it was 5 or more with a remainder and down without, how close what is given came out with my tally. The way that they come up with it is a very convoluted way that, let's say you have 2.45 is your when you divide things up, do you get 2 or do you get 3? Well, the way they figure it out is they multiply 2 times 3, which you get 6, and then you come up with the square root of that, which basically ends up giving you 3. I don't know why they came up with that in the 1940s. It's stupid and ridiculous, but there's about 4 other different ways that were suggested by people like Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and later Daniel Webster of how to do it. I think my method is best and should be used because it comes out it's very close to what it should be. And with the exception of just a couple of states, Rhode Island which has 2, would only have 1. Montana would have 1 less, and Minnesota would have 1 less. And I also gave 1 to the District of Columbia, which ought to have a representative in Congress. They have a non-voting representative at the moment. So we get to the point that the legislatures are drawing the lines. And let me just an example that when that happens in the states, for the state legislature, they draw the lines so that the party in control, which in many states are the Republicans, stays in control. And and let me give you an example. Tony Evers, a Democrat, won the governor's race, and by 3.5% of the vote. But Republicans are going to control 67% of the seats of the state Senate and 64% of the seats in the state assembly. That's extreme gerrymandering. Chief Justice Roberts had written an opinion which basically said the Supreme Court has no power to interfere when lines are drawn according to parties in extreme gerrymandering. And although we did have an instance where New York Democrats went the other way, and they overruled an independent commission, drew their own lines to give themselves an advantage. That was thrown out by the courts, and that had to be redrawn quickly. And they ended up losing 4 seats in Congress because of in this election because of that. Now, as I think Mark mentioned, there were a lot of when things started to not be clear what was going to happen, people like Mitch McConnell said, well, it's because of bad candidates running for the Senate, and that's why we might not keep a hold of it, which was a slap in the face of Trump, because Trump had handpicked a lot of these candidates like Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker and Carrie Lake, various ones. But Trump decided to nip that idea in the bud early on the night of the election when he was interviewed, and he said, if Republicans win, it's because of me, and if they lose, it's because of them. And so anyway, when he saw the elections, according to reports leaked out from his aides who were watching the returns with him, he was fuming about what it was. He was blaming everybody, including his wife, who apparently had suggested Dr. Oz to run for Senate in Pennsylvania.
Martha, could you sort of draw your remarks to a close, please?
Sure. I'm
All right.
sorry, I didn't realize. Well, let me just say one thing about one of the reasons why we have a problem is because of how we pick the president. It's not by popular vote, it's by the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is made up of how many senators and how many representatives you have. So that a state like Wyoming has many, many times more power per vote than a state like California, who has 39 million people, and Wyoming, as I said, only had 500 and something thousand. So, and so the small states have a huge amount of power over the larger states when it comes to that. It's impossible to get rid of the Electoral College by amending the Constitution, because to amend the Constitution, it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose it, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify that amendment. And there's just no way that's going to happen. What 2 states have done, my state in Maine and Nebraska, is try to apportion the statewide vote to the candidates. So here in Maine, there's 2 districts. Each district, whoever wins, if in District 1 goes to that candidate. Whoever wins in District 2, the electoral vote goes to that candidate, and whoever wins statewide gets the other 2. Nebraska does a similar thing. If all states would agree to a system like that rather than a winner take all, we would have something that was closer to a popular vote election. It still wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be better than nothing. I had thought that I was gonna run out, not have enough to say, but obviously I had way too much to say, but I will answer questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Martha. I'm now going to ask Professor Alethea Paradis to talk to us. Alethea is a history professor in California. She's also been very involved in mobilizing people to vote, really because of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs judgment. And I'm particularly hoping that she'll talk about that, as well as the role of young people and the turnout. But I just want to say something that is remarkable about Alethea, is that she has made it her mission in life to try to make young people in America into global citizens. And she has a group called Peaceworks Travel, and she takes young Americans to parts of the world to see America's historic footprint, to make them aware of the consequences of American foreign policy. And Alethea, I salute you for what you do. It's incredibly important. So over to you, Alethea.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that kind introduction. I am a history teacher at Santa Barbara City College, and I also direct Peaceworks Travel, as Becky said. And I think the link to that will be available to you. What I would like to do now, if it is okay, and I wouldn't need your confirmation that you can see the slide deck that I have loaded. Is it
Yes,
loaded here?
that's great.
Okay, excellent. If anyone wants to follow up with me, you have both my campus email and my personal email here, and I'd be delighted to speak with any of you. Apologies in advance for possibly talking too quickly. I'd like to cover a lot, and if I am speaking too quickly or you'd like more clarification, please interrupt me. I deal mostly with Gen Z and some millennials, and you can tell that there is some amusement. That was the case, cause for great comedy from the supposed red wave. And you see that one of our homegrown comedians here, Stephen Colbert, says the red wave was more like a pink splash. It's like what happens when you accidentally wash your Klan robes with your MAGA hat. So Twitter had a fair amount of amusing observations as well. And I'm hopefully that you can see this. So I'll just, please let me know if the screen isn't working here. Olivia Juliana is a fantastic Gen Z activist. You may recall that she got in a fight with Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, and that she turned that into a fundraising bonanza and raised, last count, over $2 million for abortion rights initiatives. So Dan Rather, trusted journalist, is the red wave, the parade of angry faces on Fox News, fuming over what went wrong. Antonio Areñano, who is got his finger on the pulse, lists out some of the states here: Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Of course, the women's reproductive humor is writ large right now because of the Dobbs decision, and you see what Mrs. Dredd had to say about this. The red wave was actually just a mid-cycle spotting. In any case, what is clear is that as much as we want to believe that the Trumpism Kool-Aid has faded, it's really the historic youth turnout that is to be credited with this upset. NPR reports that Gen Z became the blue wall that held back the red wave. Circle, I recommend you follow them if you don't already. This is coming out of Tufts University. These numbers are going to go up, I believe, because the voter turnout, this is assessed in just the days right after, and it would appear that those numbers are even higher. I'm going to give you a little bit of the voter profile on Gen Z, because if you are interested in making projections for how to rescue democracy from the jaws of fascism, it's really important that we're paying attention to this demographic. Gen Z is not an ideological monolith, but they are unified in their skepticism of the mainstream parties. 1 in 8 American voters are under 30. More than half of those supported Democrats or progressive candidates. I will say, and will caution at the end though, that the Republicans are filling a vacuum that the Democrats have really failed to capitalize on. And I look forward to discussing more of this with you. No matter, Gen Z will make up the largest voting blocs in the US by 2024. What is their profile? Almost a quarter of them are Hispanic. 14% are Black, 5% multiracial ethnic, 55% non-Hispanic white. They are on track to be the best educated yet. They overwhelming majority, 59%, say that the census should have a non-binary gender option. So there is a growing browning of America that is being reflected in the demographics, and not just in the US, but I would argue in the world. And when you look at their economic profiles, at least in the blue states. By the way, this slide deck is available to you if you want to follow along. I believe that the moderators have placed the link to this in the chat, and in the speaker's notes are the sources for the graphics and the data that I'm presenting here. Median annual incomes in the blue states, and we're mostly talking the progressive coastlines, pretty bleak, right? 34,000 is the median, and the data there shows it goes as high as $41,000 annually a year. They are resisting exploitative employment environments, and they are projected to be almost a third of the workforce pretty soon, by 2025. They are, and this is from the Pew Research Center, they are more likely than older generations to look at the government to solve problems rather than businesses and individuals. They don't believe in this gospel of the free market, generally speaking. They sincerely believe that is the role of government, especially given the high taxes that we are all paying. And by that, I mean, roughly 30% of our income, that we should have universal health care. We should have basic social safety net, housing, education. And the Democrats had best listen and pay attention to this. So what motivates them? So what I intend to share with you here is first, the scholarship, right? John Della Volpe is amazing. He's at the Harvard Kennedy School of Politics, and this is his, kind of work for which he is most known. And he's also, he's great to follow on Twitter, or if Twitter goes under, follow him on Mastodon, which will be the alternative coming shortly. But what I'm going to share with you here is kind of not, show you a little bit of data, and I'm going to give you some anecdotal testimonies from members of Gen Z. And these are some of my students, some of my son's friends, very bright individuals who are in college and resisting what they see as failures of the older generation. Right? Because these kids were born into September 11, war on terror, Hurricane Katrina, financial crisis, housing crisis, opioid epidemic, mass school shootings, climate change, racial injustice, right? All of it. And so while they are more stressed, anxious, depressed than previous generations, they are also not taking it sitting down. They are becoming much more active, much more resistant to economic inequality. They're more politically engaged than their elders were at their age, and they're showing a really unique creativity in disrupting the status quo. So from the data that, coming from John Della Volpe, and I might be mispronouncing his last name, but I adore him in any case. This is a recent poll, right? This is a Harvard youth poll. Inflation is important. First most important issue, second most important issue. And inflation needs to be understood as economic inequality, pressures, like the chasm, the delta, if you will, between the cost of living and the ability to support oneself as a student. Abortion ranks up there. Protecting democracy, climate change, gun control, immigration, crime, student loan debt fairly low down here, which is interesting. I would submit for your consideration that the student loan debt relief plan of the Biden administration, while well-intentioned and ideally will yield some benefits, really tends to benefit people age 25 and older. And as we know now, it's been stalled and it's poised to go to the Fifth Circuit and may or may not yield results. So what I'm going to share with you briefly here are some testimonials from young people. And I've given their first names, their age, and their university here. So when I sent out and the data sample is small, admittedly. I mean, we're talking, I sent out inquiries to 25 of the smartest Gen Zers I know, and these are some of the responses I received back. So, climate. Young people are rightfully terrified, depressed about their futures due to the climate catastrophe. They're tired about hearing Democrats talk about how something really needs to be done, but not taking significant concrete action. A few subsidies here and there for electric cars is not nearly enough. The Sunrise Movement is doing great work with this, and the Democrats should listen and take action. So the Sunrise Movement, again, I'll rely on some of you sweet moderators to put in the chat. I have a document with source notes and links to all of the organizations that I'm mentioning here that are kind of cutting edge Gen Z activist groups. Gun violence. We had a school shooting this morning in Virginia, and it's become so commonplace here in the United States that it doesn't even always make the top headlines. David Hogg is the kind of most prominent, noteworthy of the voices that have emerged out of the Parkland school shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School. And 22 years old, recognizes we will change things if people stand up for what they believe in against injustice and death to save themselves and the future of America and the world. Another hot take, which is spot on in my judgment, from Twitter, right? This is right after the election. Republicans are amazed that the kids they gleefully put through active shooter drills grew up to vote against them. So the Republican stance on this unregulated gospel of automatic weaponry is not hitting the mark with young people. Student debt and the cost of living. This is really among the saddest of the phenomena I have personally witnessed. Juanita and Trevor, they live together, and they shared with me this. Quote, Biden's modest student debt relief is welcome and probably helped Democrats in the midterms, but it should have gone much further. 10 grand is a start if it ever happens, but we know many students who owe over $250,000 of student loans. And I can attest to you, again, on an anecdotal data gathering level, this is not, there's a number of people in their 40s that are, so effectively they're millennials, millennial generation. This is a pretty common number for liberal arts degrees, right? Where this isn't just med school, it's not just law school, these are liberal arts degrees. They're $250,000 in debt, and it's disturbing, to put it mildly. The majority of us live with many roommates or with our parents. As skyrocketing housing costs basically ended the American dream of owning a home. The rent for a one-bedroom apartment here, and here admittedly is one of the most expensive communities in California, I'm in Santa Barbara. The rent for one-bedroom apartment here has doubled since 2013, and that is true. I verified the data. Look at transitionhouse.com if you want further on that. Juanita says it's not possible to work your way through college anymore. The pay's too low, the rent's too high, the debt is destroying our futures. Reproductive rights, not to be outdone by the economic catastrophe facing Gen Z. Abortion is causing a brain drain as students choose to attend colleges in states where abortion is legal. Already, OBGYN med students are picking residencies in abortion-positive blue states and universities. So this will lead to anemic reproductive health infrastructure in red states. And of course, that hurts primarily people of color and the poor. I'm making my way through here. Don't worry, we're nearing our conclusion of the depressing slides. The voices from the young people. So I hope you're seeing they're angry and they're also committed. They're angry and they're also reachable because they want to see real solutions. As of today, University of California graduate students went on strike today, 48,000 of them, because of unreasonably low pay. So you're seeing, this is from Jordan at Pitzer College, sharp rise in the last year of labor activism, rapid spread of unionized Starbucks stores being driven by young people. A lot of young people are taking really clever guerrilla strategies, salting these corporations by working there with the point of organizing. And the Biden administration could do more, right? They could be more pro-labor. The National Labor Relations Board could be much stronger in prosecuting illegal union busting and really bringing these billionaires to account. Regarding Trumpism, this is also from Jordan. Most young people do not like Trump or Trumpism, but Democrats need to avoid, I'm stating this in a more affirmative language, they need to avoid running on these platitudes without offering a concrete alternative. And they need to offer young people something to vote for rather than only against. John Fetterman is a great example of a candidate who actually ran on concrete economic issues and won. So what are the strategies? I'll take 5 more minutes on this, and then I promise I'll stop talking. Really, that Gen Z is excellent at authenticity. And the strategists are saying, they're correct in my judgment, top Democrats have to invest in on-the-ground micro-influencers. Who is the Black micro-creator in a place who understands local culture? Who's making jokes at the local mall and understands the subculture in a place? Those are the folks who are going to be able to reach thousands of voters who are going to be the deciding factor in a lot of elections. More focus on progressive policies, less on this bipartisanship as a merit unto itself. It's not a winning value for young people. You can't negotiate with fascists. You can't, they're false equivalents to say, okay, well, let's just take the two and split the difference. Now you have to recognize that the Gen Z is very disillusioned by the political process. They don't believe in these structures. They don't believe in these, the old way of doing things, scare quotes. Now, they don't crave moderation, though. They want the candidate or the person that is going to push forward bold measures to get something done. Reparations, canceling student debt, police reform. They want to see people actually in positions of like candidates. The Democrats need to put forward younger, more vibrant candidates. They need to build coalitions at the local level. And I'm going to give you an example from the abortion fight in Kansas, because I followed this very closely. Alejandro, who ran the New Frontiers Project in Southwest Kansas, this was a collaboration for the what became called the Vote Nay campaign. Vote Nay. And I may come back to this slide here, but essentially, the Vote Nay campaign was centered, this was a unifying, marketing plan to aggregate a number of different organizations that really knew what was going on regionally. And they had to figure out, okay, what's going to work with white women in Topeka is not going to work in the rural agricultural communities where it's mostly Hispanic voters, right? And traditionally, the wisdom has been that Hispanic voters are anti-abortion. Well, that is not really true. It's bearing out to illustrate. So the vote nay, they were playing on this kind of equestrian horse Western theme. They used tactics of canvassing, fun events, pony rides, all ages recruitment, multicultural outreach. You see all the different colors of people, and these are horses with cute sunglasses. Join your herd, right? And they included all the main cities. And if you look on their website, right, how did they do it? They just said, in really succinct language. Look at the gender neutral kind of depictions here. Yes, you know, you'd say they're women, but not necessarily. It could be non-binary. And they're saying, hey, our rights are under attack. Our first is to put the decision of banning or protecting legal abortions in the hands of the voters. Youth power coalitions fighting for the safety, privacy, autonomy of all. To that we say, giddy up and vote nay. And then they summarize what the amendment was, because it was deliberately misleading. Value them both was supposedly pro-woman and pro-blastocyst. I don't know, right? It's not quite a person yet. And they defeated this basically by pointing out, hey, we're not going to let this happen. And they nailed it. It was brilliant, and people are taking note. So I encourage any of you who are looking at strategies in which to mobilize Gen Z voters. This is a successful example. This happened in the summer. Like, you know, how do you get people involved in it and to, you know, get to a midterm election in the summer? They pulled that off. The other thing that Gen Z and millennials together are doing, and this is, you know, this is cut and paste from Teen Vogue, and the link is in the notes. They are big on digital disruption. Recall that there was this prank where Donald Trump, his June campaign rally in Tulsa was punked by some digital disruptors, right? And they basically, using TikTok, they hacked it and basically, you know, had them believing they had this overwhelming attendance, and you know, fewer than 6,200 were in the arena. And this, you know, a 17-year-old who can't yet vote says, you know, yes, this shows the power my generation holds can't be quantified in the voting booth. Another one regarding, and I love this so much, regarding resisting SB 8, which is the Texas voter law that basically, as Mark rightfully pointed out, is like worthy of The Handmaid's Tale. This law weaponizes it weaponizes busybodies to get in people's business, and it provided a $10,000 reward to those who would report on anyone aiding, abetting, or seeking an abortion. And so you see here, right, she's Secretary of State, I believe, of Texas, Mrs. Betty Bowers. It's imperative that you report suspicious abortion-y activity to this hotline. Well, Gen Z, young people, Gen Z and millennials together, spammed the site with phony reports on MAGA abortionists, hilarious memes. This was one of them. This is a mural in San Antonio, which is showing Greg Abbott and Ted Cruz, two reviled Republican politicians. Finally, GoDaddy, the web hosting server, took note and shut it down. So what can Democrats do? I know I'm talking a lot. Bear with me. I'm almost done.
Yeah, please wind up shortly.
Yes, thank you. Educated Gen Z is a threat. So you're seeing all this critical race theory, book banning, you know, voter suppression is all related to that. What the Democrats need to do is stop taking them for granted. I'll state it in the positive. Take action on issues young people care about. Stop marginalizing the progressive voting wing of the party. Invigorate the party with younger leadership, and reverse these anti-democratic forces of Republicans. In particular, the Democrats didn't run any specific Spanish ad campaigns, and MAGA is filling the void in this. The Republicans are filling the void. So I thank you so much for listening, and I hope, Mark, that you can take some of this back to, you know, take it back to DC and have them really take note.
Thank you so much, Alethea. That was brilliant. And I have to tell you that I'm sure that there are a lot of the people listening in the UK who would find a lot of your points relevant to progressive politics here, and we could learn quite a lot of lessons. Okay, we're going straight into questions, and the first question is from Paul Reynolds, and this I'm going to direct to Mark. He's asking, how protected is NATO as the chief vehicle of collective security from both, how protected is it from both the isolationist Republicans and the radical left of the Democratic Party? Mark, please.
Well, thank you. We could probably spend a whole hour just on this and what the implications are for foreign policy. But I think where we have to start is that going into this, the conventional wisdom was one thing and the reality is another. And so we have to recalibrate what it all now means in terms of what comes out of the House, what comes out of the Senate, and obviously what the president is going to do. In terms of, remember, let's just assume that the Republicans take the House. They have a 4-seat majority or so. It is going to be extremely difficult for them to govern because that 4-seat majority has meant that the far right, the Lauren Boebert, if she wins her race, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Matt Getzes, and so on, will have vetoes over things. So it is likely to push the House further to the right. But remember, for a number of things, that has to then get through the Senate, and we control the Senate. And so that is one significant handbrake. The other was going into this, the assumption was that Joe Biden would still have veto power over anything that didn't reach the 60 vote threshold to be veto proof. So I think going directly to the question about NATO right now, that's more a question around Ukraine. I think that's the policy outlook, if you will, as opposed to the broader question of NATO. I think if you put that question to most people in Congress, their eyes would glaze over right now and would focus more on two things: one, Ukraine, and secondly, China. And obviously, China is outside the NATO footprint, though on a call with various senior folks not so long ago, there was a recognition that that NATO needs to have sort of an out of organization focus. But I think more importantly to your question is, what is legislation going to look like? What is Washington going to look like, on the assumption, again, that the Republicans take the House by 3 or 4? About the only thing I think that they're going to be able to do is to exercise their investigations power and to hold endless investigations around the withdrawal from Afghanistan. COVID will be back on the line. You can imagine that Anthony Fauci, a favorite target of the far right, will be up there, a la Benghazi hearings that we saw for poor Secretary Clinton back whenever that was in 2015. So all to say, good news again is they don't have the Senate, which also means confirmations of a number of diplomats that those positions are still open, which again bears on the whole NATO question. And then finally, the president's view of where things are. We'll also have to touch, or people would reasonably want to ask what it means for 2024, but we can come to that later.
Thank you. Now we have a question from John Innes, who asks, what do these results imply for a possible Democratic presidential candidate in 2 years' time? Who will that candidate be, do you think? And is Trump going to be the Republican candidate? Who'd like to take that question?
I can talk about that. Let me take the second part first. I underestimated the American public. I did not think that the idea of protecting our democracy that they would understand that. But clearly they were sick and tired of the election deniers. They did not. They fed up with this idea that our elections don't matter and that you can just say, no, I won and somebody stole the election and then it'll all go away. They believe in our system and do it. So the question number 2, the second part of that is, will the Republican Party decide whether it is, as Christie has said, the party of me or the party of we. If it's the party of me, then they stay Trump. If it's the party of we, then they stop being the party of Trump and they go and start trying to represent the American people instead. And I think that the latter is more likely because of what happened in this election. The election deniers did not win. And so I think that even if Trump runs, he will not get the nomination. Number for the Democratic thing, I think Joe Biden's been a good president, and I think he's tried very hard, and I think he's had a lot of obstacles that have gotten in his way for whatever reason. But in some ways, I hope he doesn't run. If I had somebody who I wanted to run for president, it would be Michelle Obama. But I don't know, but I don't think she wants the job. And so I think it's up, the Democratic is up for grabs. The vice president has not had a big profile in around the country. And so I don't know if she would have a chance if Biden said he wasn't going to run. There are a few out there who, Chuck Schumer wouldn't win the nomination. I don't know who would appeal to Gen Z and not, Bernie Sanders is also too old to run. I know he appeals to a lot of people in Gen Z, and I give Bernie credit for bringing the party back from the right of center back to left of center. But the question is, who will show up, who can be a great candidate? And, it may just be a Republican. It may just be one of the people who won their races, the retiring governor of Maryland.
Martha, sorry, I'm going to jump in here. I think, and again, I haven't done the polling on it, but the feeling that I'm getting from the research that I've done is that Gen Z will kind of hold their nose and vote for Biden. I mean, bless him, he's doing a great job in my judgment, but like the old white guy, doesn't represent them so much. If the Democrats put forward some progressive agenda that is actively like addressing Gen Z needs, I think that is really where the Democratic Party needs to focus its attention and stop marginalizing people like AOC and those voices. And then you can have that big tent and still run a Biden-Harris ticket. And, the Gen Zers are not, they don't believe in that system anyway. They're long game on getting their needs met. So that's my 2 cents.
With the exception of the fact that Mandela Barnes didn't win, and a lot of people said that was because he was too liberal. So who knows?
Just to be a little provocative, Becky, I don't know how much time you have, but one of the difficulties with the progressive wing, there are ideas and then the way they're put forward. And let me just go to the bellwether, my 2 bellwether candidates, Alyssa and Abigail Spanberger, Michigan 8, then Michigan 7, and Western Virginia. They kept asking their more progressive elements to come to their districts just for a day. Because if they came for their districts just for a day, they would have seen what it is that they have to deal with every day. And whether it's a rural outreach, there are a number of things that work successfully here because of that rural outreach. And unfortunately, the delivery on the progressive side just simply didn't help. And if we had given more airtime, and by the way, you will have seen in the midterms very little focus by AOC and the others. And I think they recognize that in 2020, their messaging didn't help. And I know that around both of the younger cohorts, it is important that we figure out a way to tap in. Climate change is huge. That alone is more important. And if you look at what Joe Biden, the old guy, did, and Chuck Schumer, And Joe Manchin delivered on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most significant, $730 billion on climate change. If we don't have climate, we don't have a planet. We don't have planet, we don't have politics. If I had to give my my predictions, Michelle Obama, by the way, never wanted to come to Washington. It wasn't her idea in the first place, and will never come back to Washington as a politician. I do suspect that Joe Biden will run again, and there are a variety of reasons for that, including the fact that this race, once we get past the next couple of weeks, will be seen as a referendum on his agenda. Because remember, I said going back to May, we had a problem, and one of the problems we had was that he hadn't delivered to the same extent that people had expected. Again, out there going back to what have Democrats done for me? So it combined the bilateral infrastructure bill, which is roads, which is bridges, which is tunnels, which is fixing things, rural broadband. People will recognize that that was Joe Biden. That was the Democrats. Republicans voted by and large against all of these things. So people will remember that. If I had to guess, if it wasn't Joe Biden, Gretchen Whitmer. I think it is time that we have a woman, and what Gretchen pulled off from the Midwest and Michigan is beyond outstanding. On the other side, I suspect Trump will want to run again. The question is whether he's indicted, whether there are any other reasons why he can't, but he's incapable of not running. So then the question is, who else do you have on that list? You've got Pence, you've got Tim Scott, South Carolina Senator, you've got Rick Scott, Florida Senator, you've got Pompeo, you've got Haley, you've got Cruz, and you've got Youngkin. But most importantly, right now, you have Ron DeSantis. I think he's the bright, shiny thing, and that his star will fade over, at least in the short term. And then finally, Larry Hogan.
Did you say Chris Sununu?
No, I don't think Chris. Chris decided to step back in New Hampshire. He was happy to be governor. I'm not sure. I don't know him. I know Maggie Hassan. So again, I'm not tied in on the other side as perhaps I should be. That's an interesting name, and given the fact that you're sitting in Maine, Chris is just down the street, so to speak.
One of the things you mentioned was, back into the rural areas. A friend of mine named Chloe Maxman, I put it on the feed, wrote a book called Dirt Road Revival. She ran, right out of Harvard, and was elected to the state, the lower house, and then the Senate, and going door to door on the back dirt roads, including mine, and knocking on doors and trying to get people to listen. She listened to people and tried to understand what it was they wanted. And the Democrats didn't do that in 2016, and that's why they lost the belt. And they need to do that. I agree. And
John Fetterman's campaign did that. Fetterman's campaign did that exact same thing, and that worked.
I highly recommend Chloe's book for anybody who's interested in that approach.
Okay, thanks. I would like to move this on with an interesting question from Pell Tanner. He asks, is the US education system up to the challenge when social media has virtually no bounds? Who would like to take this? Alethea?
Is what up to the challenge?
Education.
The US education system.
We're doing our best. We are we're doing our best. A lot of high schools have added media literacy courses and really tried to. You may recall in the 80s there was this big push for STEM. It was like, science, technology, engineering, and math. STEM is everything. Humanities are useless. Like, focus on STEM. Well, the humanities are now pointing to society and saying, really, we need to invest in humanities education, because that's where a lot of the critical thinking is happening. And not that there's not in STEM, of course there is, but as far as looking at the value of literature and history and political science and philosophy and religion and gender and queer studies and all of these nuances of the human experience, it is difficult when these giant media corporations are not held account in the democratic process in the way that one might argue they ought to be. But I have to say that I'm a hopeaholic myself, and I see a lot of educators doing the good work of trying to combat disinformation and really foster the value of critical thinking, especially with media consumption.
But except for one of the, if the red states are taking books off the shelf, I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird and, you know, things that you would never have thought they were going to take off the shelf, never mind queer studies books. I mean, I'm not so sure that we can, if we leave everything totally up to the
Yeah, that was the purpose for my slide here, right? I mean, Angie Thomas made this, you know, this meme went around, and she is the award-winning author of The Hate U Give, and exactly right. An educated Gen Z is actually a threat to the Republican Party. So
there's one other element to this, which is, you know, in the United States, we have this default to 4-year education, and whether it's a 2-year education or the certification programs a la what Germany has had for years. I think, and there is an awareness in certain parts of the Democratic Party for the need to reimagine jobs and reimagine training for jobs, retooling for more sustainable economy, which then means going back to revisit the 2-year, 4-year college, as opposed to certification programs where when people come out, they have a skill and that they can start working on that, whether it's welding or whatever it was in the old economy. So I think that, you know, again, when education comes up, there are any number of different elements to this, but from a purely sort of Machiavellian, somewhat cynical political view, it's about getting jobs back, right? And we talked about the Rust Belt, we talked about rural areas, getting, by the way, rural broadband. Again, Democrats delivered on rural broadband. If you don't have broadband, you simply do not have education. You have no prospect for jobs. The Republicans stood in the way time and time again. They had their opportunity and they failed to do this. So yeah, part of the problem we had was to make people aware. Now, the fascinating thing about the Republicans, and they're brilliant at this, they vote against things and then they take credit for it, and they get credit for it in elections. And even this time around, this may have been an issue for us, but for the fact that there were other things. But again, the American Rescue Plan had put $1,400 per person into the hands of people making whatever it was, less than $75,000. That's what got us past the pandemic. Republicans voted against that. So you can continue on the litany of things. Go ahead, Martha. Just saying.
I just want to make 2 points from Maine. And that is, here in Maine, one of the governor's plans was to make free anybody who graduated from high school from 2020 through 2023, 2 years of community college or technical school, total tuition, free, if you go to one in Maine. Secondly, with this broadband thing, there is no oversight in this broadband program, and I live in a rural community where you can see that I'm a few feet from the lake behind me, a rural community which was supposed to be high on the list of getting high-speed broadband. However, when I called to see the cable company to see when I could get it, I was told that we couldn't get it because they didn't have the lines in our area. Instead, they were putting higher speed down in Falmouth and Portland, in the cities where they already had it. And so, I mean, I keep meaning to, make a formal complaint to the federal government.
Can we get back to Gen X, please? Wendy Carol Pope asks, does Trump and the far right get the danger of Gen X that Alethea, you have been articulating so well? Alethea?
Actually, Gen Z, you mean, because I'm Gen X.
Sorry.
And yes,
Sorry, Gen Z.
I know I look young, but actually, does Trump, so the Republican Party is filling this vacuum of really targeting Gen Z. And I have to say, I think the Democrats could do better. They need to really focus in on attending. They can't take Gen Z for granted, and they've just been assuming that Gen Z is going to default to them because of Bernie. But I mean, what Bernie offered, but all of Bernie's turnouts when he went around to all of these college campuses, when he visited 20 college campuses at the midterms, just packed the house. And so the Democrats need to fill this vacuum because the MAGA Republicans are doing it for them, if not.
Mark, did you have something on this?
Contradict me, Mark. You're muted.
Yeah, one of the difficulties that Democrats had, and by that the Democratic infrastructure, in addressing the Gen Z opportunity is that we got off to a few false starts, and part of that was that it failed to recognize that, and Alethea, you'll have a better sense of this, that the Gen Z and the millennials don't take to labels. They don't view themselves as Democrats or Republicans. They don't view themselves as liberals versus conservatives. Instead, they're animated by issues, and rightly so. But that makes it more difficult because we historically have been the big tent, and we haven't been as successful, thankfully, as the Republicans of laser-like focus on a single issue. So we come at it with a number of issues, but there are, I think, a significant reason to be hopeful, and that is data. Because that's the other thing that Democrats have finally understood. Remember, Republicans, by the way, after Obama did so well in terms of digital, then spent hundreds of millions of dollars to get their digital up to speed, which they did in 16 and 18. Tom Perez at the DNC realized that this was a significant hole, and so we have been working on that ever since. But the whole digital issue comes down to that the ecosystem around these elections, and it's any number of groups, including, and I meant, Alethea, I will send you this, these, and I'm trying to remember, but Vote for Good efforts, which is to get micro influencers on TikTok and others to spread the messaging, and then embedding in that technology the ability to register to vote and to vote. Now, these efforts have largely been around elections, and have been, tens of millions of dollars were spent in those various groups, of which there are many, starting with Run for Something, which only supports Amanda Littman, is just hugely, hugely impressive, and supporting candidates for state legislature under 35. So all to say that I think that the short, whatever focus that Republicans have, while they're still kind of enshrined in this more reactionary endeavor, we have a far better shot at all this. And remember too, that Republicans haven't stood for anything for 6 years. It's always been no. And so that makes it very difficult for people to then, other than pure ideology, say, wow, this really makes sense.
One thing I would love if you could take back to the top is they need to have a very dedicated Spanish language ad campaign, because that's where the Republicans are filling the gap. And it doesn't cost a lot of money, to do that. And it really would make a huge difference. I mean, Florida, forget Florida, but Texas is pretty purple, and that would work there.
So I happen to have spent the election night with Tom Perez. And Tom Perez had focused 4 years to get this fixed. So I think we're making headway, and I think we'll have to see what the outcome is. But I believe that we will be far more positive about the efforts outside of South Florida. South Florida is a problem because Florida is a problem. And so if you look at Texas, if you look at Colorado, if you look at Arizona, if you look at Nevada, I was on the phone with the Voto Latino folks and any number of others who are actually quite pleased with how the Latino Latina turnout. And remember, Catherine Cortez Masto was the first Latina elected to Congress, and she is one. So I think, all of these things are important. But the other that I have learned from the DNC, the D-Trip, or whatever else, is that there's just this massive overlay, this infrastructure around organizing, this infrastructure around messaging, this infrastructure around data. And unfortunately, the Republicans have far more money. So we've had to do far more with far less.
Unfortunately, thank you, Mark. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm so sorry we haven't got to other questions. I particularly wanted to get to David Shaw's really very mischievous question: should the Democrats in future elections put money into GOP primaries supporting denier crazy candidates to help them be selected and then defeat them in the general?
Well, we did that. We did that.
That's what they did this past time.
We did
I'm
that,
sorry,
and it's a huge issue.
We've run out of time, guys. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
You're
I'm
welcome.
sorry we didn't get to more questions. Thank you very much, Alethea, Mark, and Martha. And thank you for everybody who tuned in this evening. Bye-bye. Bye.